This is the nameless protagonist. We started a little bit late, about a minute and some seconds. We will definitely compensate. But I want to give us a little bit of time, let a few folks come in. I think a couple other folks are on today. So we will go ahead and rock with that. But we've got 5 in. We'll go ahead and open the dojo irrespective and go ahead and get things started. So firstly, let me do a quick mic check. Are you guys able to hear me clearly? Go ahead and press a 1 in the chat if you can hear me. Or if it's too loud, too quiet, either or, just let me know. All right, it looks like I'm seeing some 1s. All right, that works for me. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get things started then. Firstly, to the founders of the space, os. To those that are in the chat and are listening in on the playback in the future, os. This is the nameless protagonist. Today we're going to continue with part 4 of the series that I'm doing with Miss Maggie Thompson, Under the Veil. We're going to be covering some aspects of transcendental psychology. And today's general topic will be on the idea of transcendence of the avatar in and of itself. Getting a general sense of what we're talking about with regard to the avatar and getting into some of the fundamental building blocks of what human beings understand to be their existence and the modalities of existence in spirit, body, and mind, as some would call the natural, the heavenly, and the mundane. I think this will be a pretty interesting one and follow up in the wake of this ongoing discussion that we have been really bringing in an undercurrent to and a magnifying glass under. We may even do a panel today, depending on how much time we have left over, if you guys have some questions, and I have the sense that this time you probably will. But without any further ado, let me go ahead and bring our guest up. Maggie.
Nameless.
Okay, just wanted to make sure you're still there. Good evening once again.
Good evening.
So we've got a couple folks here already. It looks like we're good to go. I think we can go ahead and get things started. I think what we can do with that quick primer we gave folks, why don't you get people hip to the story you just told me? And we can, because I want to revisit that in the future, because there's so many other events that were running parallel to this specific time period you're talking about. I want to do a formal video on that in the future, because there is a lot taking place in this period of time. But go ahead and tell them what you told me, because I think it'll be a good starting point to go ahead and veer off into this topic.
Okay. So I was talking about the Transcendentalist Movement. And a lot of times when I bring up the Transcendentalist Movement, people think more of a little bit later in time, or they think about, maybe hippie culture. They kind of bring that into mind, something a little hippy dippy kind of stuff. But the Transcendentalist Movement actually started in the 1820s, 1830s. The two primary founders were Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And the Transcendentalist Movement was in direct response to slavery. So what was going on at that point in time, they were doing a lot of this group that they had, the Transcendentalists, were doing a lot of discourse and discussion and debate and trying to figure things out about existence. And one of the not one of, the primary tenet that they have, there are multiple tenets, but the primary tenet is that each and every human being requires as much freedom as possible to be able to meet their full potential. And so, in having that base tenet and looking around at the state of the country, they became fierce fighters against slavery, because what they said was each and every enslaved person required as much freedom as possible to meet their full potential. And so they didn't feel like the abolitionists were going far enough, that just abolishing slavery was not enough, that each and every enslaved person required as much land and shelter and opportunity and access as every other single person that was living in the country. And so, of course, they liked their poetry, but they didn't necessarily like the message. They were a nonviolent group. However, they were, major cheerleaders of John Brown. they, they loved him. And when they gave speeches, they would bring him up, that they didn't hate they weren't going to do what he was doing, but they didn't hate what he was doing. And so this is the original place of the Transcendentalist movement, is this group standing in stark contrast to slavery, chattel slavery that was going on in the US, and um, really kind of biting back at the abolitionists, saying, what you're talking about is not enough. And I think that we see that now. We see that it wasn't enough, because slavery wasn't completely abolished. So that was the story.
And I think that is very important for the time period, because when we make the separation of chattel slavery versus everything else, we need to understand that there is a domesticating or domestication undertone, a artificially selected for process taking place, which really called into question the innate humanity of the people involved in the institution. And I think that term gets so overplayed that I don't think people really understand that we're talking about a demographic that was considered the same as a farm animal. I don't think that really is appreciated for how jarring it is or would have been at the time, to find a group of individuals, an entire demographic, who are on the same tier as an animal, and
Right.
then progress socially in a way where you're supposed to be taken as serious. It's like, it would be like all of a sudden dogs have an innate right that is transcribed to them or transferred to them through the Constitution, and so they have constitutional rights like everybody else does. And there's a certain way you now have to engage with talking with dogs. I, there's an adjustment period you'd have to go through. So there was a layers upon layers of assumptions about people who were involved in that institution, on what was required for them to be healthy, what was required for people to succeed and be qualified as a human being. I want to also highlight that this is the beginnings of the underpinnings that start the conversation for the theory of evolution. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting this idea, especially in anthropology, that the so-called races of humans have tiers that are applied to them. So for a very long time, there was this assumption that we just weren't part of the same, let alone family, but even phylum of human. And so that brings a greater weight of significance to why this particular topic, on top of all of that, specifically in the 1830s, would be huge at the height of the the domestic slave trade in America. Because at this point, the international slave trade is done. Go ahead.
Well, and this is also the point in time when that talk about eugenics is starting.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
That came right out of the anthropology piece. Yep.
right. And the sort of that the white people are the pinnacle of evolution.
Yeah, even 1830, that's when they're in Egypt now also.
Right. When
And
they start
so, yep.
start the archaeology there and the Egyptology that still is a problem to this day.
My thinking is with Napoleon though, and his time in Egypt and the things he ends up saying, his relationship that he had with Haiti, what ended up happening with that fallout, and in particular, his conclusions about individuals classified as black in the new Americas and the implications of what they're finding in Egypt at the time as it relates to a demographic of people who at the time are universally not even considered human, to your point. This
Mhm.
is huge.
Well, and I but we still have that going on was my point because, you have people in Egypt who are very tan, right? Who say that they are Egyptian. And at this point, they are Egyptian, but they connect themselves back to the original pharaohs and the height of the dynasty. And, sometimes results of archaeological digs and DNA evidence will be altered or skewed or presented in a way so as to ensure that those pharaohs, those people are not seen as Black African. Um, but if you read the actual studies, like one of my favorite is about Ramses and
Oh, that is hilarious.
Tutankhamun, um, Amenhotep. There's all that DNA evidence actually shows that all of those people were sub-Saharan African. And so there's no argument about sub-Saharan African. That is definitely a Black African person. And so, but then the depictions that you see, think about Elizabeth Taylor, right? And she's playing a Nubian
And
princess. You know what I mean?
I'm
Like,
not even going to get started on that. I will just simply say, in full disclosure, I my Y chromosome happens to be E1B1A.
oh, nice.
So it's funny you bring that up. I'm in direct line of effect on that. So
Yeah.
yeah, that I know exactly what you mean. It's part of what I was thinking about when I bring that up. And there's a difference between the culture, the nationality, and the actual bloodlines because we still understand that there were just waves of migrations that were always occurring, the trade routes, and the cultural origin was always from within the interior of the continent.
Right.
But it's to say that there was still that particular narrative at the time of those who were there, who came from further east and migrated to Egypt a while
Mhm.
ago. Like we know when that whole migration of Islam occurred and the
Mhm.
long Arabization of Northern Africa in general.
Mhm.
But that's who these are the people that Napoleon and his military are coming across. And
Mhm.
these are the people he's interfacing with because there's a separate conversation. I keep saying we got to have this, Maggie. I got to
Mhm.
get you and a couple of the historians on. What people are really highlighting this idea of white supremacy with, I really do lay at the feet of Persia. I really, really do. I think they're the ones that started this whole game on that. There's a lot of narrative strings attached to that region that go back to concepts, thought processes, and ways they want to reinterpret history come from patterns that I see starting from them. And it's interesting, but go ahead.
I don't necessarily disagree with you, and I've done some videos on this, and I'm doing some bloodlines videos. Just started the bloodlines videos,
Mm-hmm.
but I started with the Neanderthals, and the Neanderthals came came onto the scene as the Goths, but they came through that region, right? So you have
Right.
people, the Khazars, the Persians, the Goths who end up becoming the Roman Empire,
Yep.
Germany, France, and England.
Yep.
That's all the same bloodline. And what's interesting is to this day, those regions show the highest amount of Neanderthal admixture. And so, one of the things that I talk about in bloodlines is that this Neanderthal admixture, if you look back at archaeological evidence of how the Neanderthals were, like they were very incestuous, they were very protected, and did not want to intermingle. They intermingled with the Denisovans much more than the Homo sapiens. And these are the same people that we end up having Rh negative blood factors,
Yep.
and they refer to themselves as the blue bloods. They were also cannibals. So, very rageful, warlike, lustful. Again, you look at these regions that are some of the biggest colonizers. So I don't necessarily disagree with you. I just come at it from a different angle.
So that's what I'm really highlighting here. It's that relationship they have with the with that caucus pattern is what I'll say. And
Mhm.
the pattern I'm describing here is there's a bloodline line of effect, right? But the
Mhm.
point I'm highlighting here is the cultural line of effect.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to remind you how for that region it self imploded. And all I'm going to point to you is who came in and rebuilt it. And it's in that process that you begin to see all of that cross pollination and emulation of the very
Mhm.
things we're talking about. That's why I wanted to sit down and really deep dive into those things, because we see it happening still in that region to this day. It's why a lot of the problems exist to this day in that region. With, I won't even get into the anti-blackness conversation, but this association of phenotypical obsessions. I'll leave it at that, because I don't
Yeah.
want to drift too much. I think you're picking up what I'm putting down.
I get it.
So, all of that to say, because it ties into the greater conversation of, because what we're really asking the question of who is human and how does that qualify? Who qualifies to acquire this tag of human? And this particular period of time was being challenged on a scientific level
Mhm.
from the individuals that would get their hands on the controls to establish industrialization down the line. And this, as I was trying to articulate to you earlier, this scientification of spiritual and cultural modality. So these few families that end up taking the reins and really hijacking this potential period of enlightenment that's beginning to happen from 1850 into the early 1900s, where we see this explosion of innovation happen all over the place. These very interesting natural solutions that have successfully married technologies together. I was talking with Complex Design not that long ago, and he was getting me hip to the science of blimps and how blimps were way ahead of their time, and they were able to bridge gaps with transportation and general commerce on levels that you wouldn't even believe. But conflicts of trying to make certain things more profitable led in a completely different direction. Rael got me hip to a lot of the innovations that were coming out from George Washington Carver, where
Mhm.
it was originally designed to have the technology actually be based on plant oils, and how you had the usual suspects come in and want to degrade the efficacy of that so they can introduce these fossil fuels instead. And I think everybody understands the story with Tesla. So too do we get the overt scientification of, you can say, mental health as it's beginning to form, and psychology really as a discipline is really beginning to lean in on this idea of psychoanalysts being the end all be all definition of human peak health and condition, And anything that is borderlining a lot of the points you're describing are negative, lower mind, less human characteristics of a lesser evolved entity that can be the superior being can transcend these requirements and just be this never stopping machine that constantly moves forward. It's this false dichotomy, this distortion of what a human is so that they can fit that factory worker mold. I'm digressing slightly, but I'm trying to show the general pattern that keeps recurring with this and the origins, the genesis of this transcendental psychology really seems to be in alignment with what you're describing here, especially with the way it folds out to this day.
Well, and like I said, that was one of the issues that I had with Maslow's original theory, was because when you looked at that triangle, every one of those levels has to do with socioeconomic status. And so it essentially, the way it read on the surface was the only way you could get to transcendence was through money. Because, like, look at the very bottom, and the physiological, you need food, water, shelter. Okay, well, that takes money. And then, as you're moving up, it takes money and resources, each one of those levels, even love and belonging, right? So because when you're dating and mating, there has to be resources.
Mm.
And so that was one of the problems that I had originally. Now, he ended up moving around a little bit and going a lot deeper into transcendence, which I think is good, because people can, while on one hand we can take into consideration, yes, if I'm starving and living on the street, I'm not so much thinking about what I want to be when I grow up. I've
Right.
I've got bigger fish to fry, right? It sort of seemed like this weird capstone that he put on the top of that pyramid. Like, I could rock with everything he was saying, and then we just capped it off with transcendence. And it's like, wait, we went from things that has to do with money and resources and ended with spiritual enlightenment. How did that happen? I
So,
liked his later work.
yeah, that's exactly where I'm going to. I actually came across Maslow backwards. So I came across his later work first. And
Ah,
then I came across his earlier stuff. Eventually, I was like, okay, I see his progression now. I got an interesting book here called The Further Reaches of Human Nature. And what I found out, and this is why this ended up happening, which is unfortunate, he originally was not going to release his work. He had been working on some of it, but he had some very close friends that convinced him to do it because he ended up getting terminal cancer.
mhm.
So he only had about a year or so left to live while he was working on this. So he gets to this point where he gets this bottleneck, does all of this travel, realizes he needs to do a 180 on his work, and then he gets hit with cancer. And he's like, you know what? Let me try to get as much as I can done with all of this. And it ended up being that all his transcripts were sent to family and friends overseas. They were the ones that actually finished his work for him after he passed. So he's got a couple really good books that touch on exactly what you just said. One of them is The Further Reaches of Human Nature, and the other one is Future Visions. And it gets into all of that stuff that didn't really get released from the official institutional perspective. And we know at the time, so we're talking like 61, 62, a lot of that stuff wasn't coming out anyway because Jung's work was pretty much dominating that conversation.
Mhm.
And it really wouldn't even be until the late 90s that a lot of his work ends up making a boomerang swing back again. And when they do introduce him, they only ever talk about his early work.
Right.
So you get that 5-step pyramid that's like it can be transcribed into how to be a good slave, essentially.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because that was the real he was getting to where a lot, especially how the Tao and this this period of martial arts and rediscovery of Asia is happening from the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Mhm.
That's what he was on. So he was on that Alan Watts wave. That's where he
Mm.
was leading towards. So that is actually where I wanted to eventually get into with some of my own personal content and really, really highlighting these concepts of transcendence, because that was his inevitable conclusion ultimately. It's like the goal is to transcend this state and to understand that the state is a training ground for ascending something that's very non-physical in nature. The goal isn't to have the material. The goal is to exist in spite of it.
I think if you overlay it to all of those ancient scripts about battling through stages. I mean, you've got Dante's Inferno, you've got Inanna's
Mm,
trip to the underworld, you even got Jung's archetypes, you've got the hero's journey. I mean, we just have this story. Mary Magdalene's vision of the
mm,
seven beasts. It You have this ancient story that plays over and over again about battling through these sort of false ideas to get to transcendence. So if you
mm.
overlap Maslow's with that story, those stories, it makes much more sense that transcendence was perched on the top as the capstone.
Yep. Yep. Which I think was originally articulated as self-actualization. And
Yes,
it was the realization that that's actually just a starting point. Really,
right.
that's really the launch point that you truly begin that journey of ascendance towards. But it's paying homage to the fact that you have to go through this turmoil, get a baseline established, and from that baseline, work your way through the process. And that puts us smack dab in the face of rituals of initiation that are a recurring motif with human beings, irrespective of the culture you go to.
Oh, for sure. Because if you overlap it with the hero's journey, right, it's a constant circle. You reach self actualization and then you're questioning the very basis of that pyramid again. What do I eat? Where do I live? How do I subsist? And then you work your way up again and you fully come back around. But the only way to start that hero's journey is something that, we used to have those rites of initiation. We used to, as humans, we did that for, tens,
Yep.
if not hundreds of thousands of years. And now it's sort of like something has to happen to you that you overcome. And then you're like, oh, I can overcome things or I can do things, I can battle through things. And that's when you start on that journey of self discovery. But
Mm.
until that happens, it's just sort of you don't really start that journey of looking at yourself until something happens that you have to overcome in an artificial way because we don't have these rites of passage anymore. And the ones that we do have, quinceañeras and,
Yeah,
stuff
they're
like
pretty
that, those are
superficial. Yeah.
right, right. It's a pretty dress, and now I'm a woman. You know what I mean? Um, for women, the unfortunate thing is that the rite of passage to be seen as a woman is to have a child. And so then you have young women that are in a huge rush to have a baby so they can be seen as a grown woman. Because until then, there is, and this is amongst women, there's sort of a, well, you're not doing a woman thing. So pat on the head, move along.
So I see exactly the point you're aiming at. And I would say it's interesting to observe how that plays out as we shift from a Paleolithic existence into the hunter gatherer phase. I'm sorry, into the God, what am I saying? Uh The agrarian. I always have a problem with that word because I want to say agrarian. It's the way it's spelled and the way you pronounce it. It's just I'm used to reading that word, not saying it.
It's a bit like Gregorian.
Yeah, yeah. That whole period where we've got animals and plants and we're
Mhm. The
making cities
domestication.
now. Right. We've got this farmstead, homestead sort of pattern. The value system originally had time to shift with the culture. Like having kids makes sense, a lot of sense in the context of having that additional assistance and assurance. But then things start changing when you don't update the culture to make sense for the environment that you're in, or you find yourself, and I'll use my demographic as an illustration, where the rites of passage gets distorted. The advent of having a child was supposed to be a community based modality that, and I talk about this in my verbal sword forms when I got into the whole seventh form about portals, where bringing new people into the culture and society was a community based modality where there was an intention behind bringing those children there. And it was oftentimes this understanding that they're a part of a greater community that exists beyond the veil in the form of ancestors, and that oftentimes there's this revolving door of people coming and going. And due to the order or the context of your birth, there would be an expectation or a allocation as to who you were and aspects of your personhood and being and personality, even down to the day you arrive. So you were not only anticipated, you were expected, and you had a role that was highlighted for you that was purposeful. You had many things that you could do to, I guess, deviate from that, so to speak. But there was always a place for you within the society, and the society had a way to prepare you for that. And the majority of your upbringing was all about giving you the skills to do so. So that if you did get to the position to where children are involved, or you're getting into your role as a man or a woman within that modality, that title of man and woman was something that occurred as a result of your rites of passage ritual. There's just certain things you did to be recognized with that. You were understood to be male and female, and you grew
Mhm.
up as a boy and girl, respectively, but man and woman was directly related to that rites of passage that your upbringing was preparing you for. So when we fast forward into this shift into this new era of being more urban, and we don't have that interdependent mechanism that's there, or the ways to which we are interdependent are through degrees of separations from various institutions. And there isn't a cultural update to provide that contextual meaning, to provide surrogate replacements for that, followed by a succinct divorcing of the spiritual modalities that gave you access to the unseen. You start running into these cheapened, really, I don't want to apply too much negativity to it, but it's kind of like having a social, I'm going to call it like a social, I don't want to call it a disease. It's like getting diabetes culturally.
Mhm.
So you do certain things that have a good intention behind it. Okay, I'm going to call them a cultural autoimmune issue. That's how I'll describe it temporarily right now to really articulate the point. It's an autoimmune issue in that it's originally for a meaningful purpose and something that was intended to be positive, that had its purpose and role. But because of the environment we're in now and because of the context it happens under, it ends up causing more harm than good. Because it becomes a question of, is it good that you have so many people now being brought into the world for absolutely no reason other than the fact that they were born? And I'm not trying to advocate for an anti-life argument here. I'm saying that there's a difference between people who are brought into the world with intention and those that are brought into the world as a matter of bad decisions or just being coped with because of somebody being lonely. I think that's a big issue most people are not comfortable having that conversation with regards to, but I think this is a byproduct of the first industrial world being pushed in this direction.
Well, I think intention is the big word there because and you had even said it, you when we're making farms and we're domesticating animals and we're coming together as communities instead of nomadic. So to back up, when humans were nomadic, the the group would grow to a certain threshold, and then a chunk of those people would sort of wander off to find a different place. So that's why we have so much disbursement, right? And we have certain people stayed put and other people wandered off into different regions, over thousands of years. But when we when we look at when we go from a child being a gift from the spiritual world to a child being another set of hands for the farm, the intent changes. So we can watch how we start, instead of viewing a child as a gift from the spiritual realm, and now they're here for me, we can fast forward to this age that we live in where our elderly parents and grandparents are looking to their children and grandchildren to take care of them. Now, in a certain way, in a community, you should take care of the elders, but it's sort of like you have a bunch of people whose retirement plan is their children and grandchildren. Right? So we go from, instead of setting up my child to become a man and to go forth and to prosper and populate and live his life and be successful, we go from we get to don't go too far and be sure you make lots of money. And when you go buy a house, make sure there's a room for me. Because when I retire, I don't have any money. I spent all my money. And so, or I never got any money. And so my retirement plan is you. So we switch over to this, instead of parents setting their kids up or like people inheriting things anymore, if they ever, some family lines that never ever happened, but we don't set up our kids anymore. They our intent to have them, you said it, loneliness, our intent to have them has changed. And something in transpersonal psychology is that intent means everything. Even looking at, my doctoral thesis is going to be on altruism, because the intent behind your help changes how the help is received, and whether that you could do the same thing to two different people with two different intentions and the result will be different because of your hidden intention. And so in changing our intentions and how we view children, children are supposed to be for us, for us, to do things, to work for us, to do chores around the house, to, go get the mail, take out the trash. And when you get older, you're going to take care of me. And that is us moving into this age. There's lots of reasons for it, but when you're talking about intention, that's what it really made me think of.
And it's so interesting because what we're talking about here fundamentally is the commoditization of human life. And it's where you get the child being born for no purpose and being allocated at birth as a set of debt, essentially. And to
Right.
me, that sounds exactly like the slave system.
Right. Well, you're born in debt and you die in debt. It costs money to be born and it costs money to die.
A
And you're
lot,
it,
a
it
lot.
is kind of like well, I mean, I can see what you're talking about. If we're going to go into wage slavery, which,
Well, what I mean by that is when we talk about, because I'm going to get into, I'm not going to get into that because that's going to be a whole other digression. here's here's how I will appeal that point to bring people to understand that when we get into the type of slavery that occurred here in America, for example, the determination of whether one is a slave or not was determined by the mother. And that goes off of an understanding of ownership and assets. So, what a lot of people didn't know is this is where you get a lot of the beginnings for certain insurance policies. You could actually open up a line of debt on a slave the moment it was born, and that would appreciate over time and have value. You could borrow against their potentially perceived value. And
Mhm.
that's how a lot of people use assets to acquire wealth. It's also a big reason why a lot of people who were slave owners, which wasn't a lot of people, but enough, that's how a lot of them ended up staying in debt because they do all of that and they borrow against what they had there. And that's why they'd have all of this land and you wouldn't have nothing to show for it. But that's a digression. The point
Mhm.
is that ritual is staying in place. Now we're using things like birth certificates and all these certificates you have to get to credit that. But that's just the material part. The spiritual part of that is I paid for you. I provided food and shelter for you. You owe me. And it's not from this filial expectation that we see from Confucianism. It's this idea that the children are an expense, that they have to be, that the children are the ones incumbent in paying that back, even though they weren't the ones responsible for their being there. And so much of the upbringing is rooted in the parent explaining to them and those children being, I guess you could say, surrogates to their own expectations. Rather than being something that's invested in so they can be better than the parent is using the child as a means to justify their own existence, which oftentimes is a compensatory action to what they didn't get from their parents. And so this is just a pattern that we can point to the ground zero of this being the same time period, 1850s, getting into this transition of uh, lessons that weren't properly dealt with yet from the agrarian society that carried over from the Paleolithic era being all of a sudden fast forwarded into this first industrial society that's now all about city, urban, buy, consume. Into now we're getting into this digital era where all the problems that just started is now being superimposed into this virtual environment where now we don't even know how to talk to anybody unless we can validate a reason for speaking to them that's related to this commodification pattern. And now we've got 150 plus years of practice for this. So it becomes self-evident.
Well, and I think to add to that, is that there is a facet, and it's up to each person to decide how big that facet is, but there is a facet of spiritual warfare that's going on around that time too, because we already had Rome co-opting the Jesus movement. We already had a lot of movement towards this monotheistic male high god who is very paternalistic. And then governments start setting themselves up in the same hierarchy that Rome had, that is also used in these Abrahamic religions. And so you have this paternalistic nature of, I will tell you who you are, I will tell you what you can and cannot do. I will You will even see this in in the South, where somebody might call a grown man son or boy or those kind of things because they feel like they're more aligned with the paternalistic nature of the government that we live in. The government views its citizens as children. If you listen to how government officials talk behind the scenes, they will talk about how stupid people are, how easily manipulated they are, how ridiculous they are, how to manipulate them. And we get our birth certificates, we get our social security number, and then the United States government uses the citizenry as collateral for their debt. So when they borrow money from other countries, when they do different things, they're moving money around, the citizenry is considered collateral based on those numbers that they're assigned. So, the game hasn't really it's changed, but it hasn't really changed, right? It's like remix, we're just going to relabel and rebrand a bunch of things, but it's all the same hegemony, the patriarchal type of things, and it's set up through the religion that we're sold, these Abrahamic religions. And I'm not talking about general Christian people or Jewish people or whatever. I'm talking about systemic stuff. It's set up and sold to us as this is how we operate. We'll tell you who you are. We'll tell you what is the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do. And then we'll set you to judging each other so that we don't have to keep an eye on you. We'll put buffer classes in place. Our surveillance is just you guys watching each other and turning each other in and judging each other and doing all these things. And I have always thought that there's a tie into spirituality when when chattel slavery was going on, and if a child was born, um, his or her place, whether they were free or enslaved, had to do with whether the mother was free or enslaved. And always throughout history, your spirituality you inherited from your mother. Your worldly inheritance you inherited from your father. So whatever resources or tools or trade or skills, your father taught you those things, but your mother taught you spirituality. And so your quote unquote religion wasn't really a thing, but your spirituality, the way that you worshiped what was beyond the earth, came from your mother. Jewish people still do that to this day. If your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. If your mother's not Jewish, you're not Jewish, even if your father's Jewish. So, the halakha, I think, is the name of the law. But to me, there is something in that we know the spiritual warfare was going on, and then they create this law that the child's state of enslavement comes from the mother, even though enslavement would be something earthly. So it always made me question the point of that.
It's the portal piece. So the whole reason why I got into that was for that reason. And I always have to remind myself that when you mention patriarchy, you're not talking about the way we're used to hearing that from intersectionalists and everybody else. Because you just got to remember, it gives us an anaphylactic reaction.
I'm sorry.
We're so used to having that being termed as anti-male. You know what I'm saying? I got to remember, you're strictly speaking from a governmental pattern that really could be interchanged with Abrahamic, almost on a one-for-one in most instances, because it's this Abrahamic model. I don't see
much difference between hegemony and patriarchy.
Well,
to me, it's roughly the same thing. And so when people are protecting this false hegemony of like the United States, right? Like Christian male, rich in a suit, Republican, you know what I mean?
Oh, wait, but that's what I mean about what we're talking about at its core are these patterns established by a lot of these Abrahamic traditions.
Oh, for sure.
So
yeah.
That's why I said you can exchange that on the one for one, because when you get into the actual, and I should really articulate 2 points. Firstly, we understand that a lot of what Judaism is speaking about, that particular pattern, that particular group of people, the whole advent of, I don't even want to get into the religious conversation now, because I'm thinking about that whole Flavius not Flavius. Yeah, it was the Flavians. Then in that Council of Nicaea incident,
Mm-hmm.
where you got the Abrahamic remix of everything that was actually tied to spiritualism. Because yeah, that was an Abrahamic modality, but there was none of that in the understanding and the teachings.
Right.
So, and then when you get into the actual esoteric science of what the small hats do, for lack of a better term, we're
Mhm.
talking
Like the
like Kabbalah
Kabbalah.
and all of that. These are all mechanisms of understanding control in a greater context, which to me rhymes a great deal with modalities of being that we would have seen in Babylon. Which is why I think Babylon has been given a artificially distorted
Mhm.
version of events by the same particular group of people. I won't get too deep into that. What I'm saying is there's a fingerprint in all of this,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
every single when you use that word, I use this Abrahamic line because it's describing the spiritual tool of legitimacy and moral authority that was
Mhm.
generally used to carry out everything you're talking about, from the Magna Carta when that got signed to going forward when we get into the institution of global chattel slavery, especially
Mhm.
the way it ended up having to play out on the continent and then ultimately in the new world. It's still these Abrahamic lines even when you get into Islam. I'm
Mhm.
not talking about the actual Muslims, not what you're seeing in Timbuktu. I'm talking about that whole issue that happened way afterwards. Shout out to Persia. And that whole justification is still an Abrahamic line. I guess the
Right.
difference between them and their predecessors, especially the Christian majority, is Muslims got to read. It was mandatory to be literate, but that's the pattern we're seeing here. These mechanisms of control, the ability to manipulate giant portions of the population using this mechanism of materialism to anchor, and then
Mhm.
controlling the material and having the
Right.
value system predicated on that.
It's moral supremacy.
Yep. By demonizing what you already had and then
Right.
reintroducing something you already knew in the image of something that looks like them. It's diabolical.
Well, that's why I refer to Yahweh as a God eater, because the advent of Yahweh and how he's morphed over time through the image of man, right? God, this God was made in the image of man. Um the Yahweh that we have today sort of has eaten aspects of other gods and absorbed them and taken them in, and then the system demonizes that god and says, well, it never existed, it's only ever been Yahweh. It's interesting if you look at the progression of Yahweh, which is the basis of the Abrahamic religions, um that this
Marduk. My bad, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. I say Marduk and I say Enlil. Um, but if you look at the progression, Yahweh was a lesser god in Kemet. He was the 13th son of Ra, and he was just a storm deity. And the Shasu worshipped Yahweh. Nobody cared about Yahweh. He was some, puny little goofball god. The 13th son. He's way down there. And over time it's Yahweh then somehow beats up all of his brothers. Look at Exodus, right? This is when he's beating up Ra, right? And he wins against all of these gods, and he absorbs. Now Yahweh is the son, right? Now he's the father, like Ra. Now he's this, now he's that. He absorbs Baal and Sin and Yam and then demonizes all of those gods and says it's idolatry, and at the same time,
Making an idol.
right, and then eventually he somehow marries his mother, and it's like, no, but I've always been married to her because I've always been the father god. And then it's, what mother? I've never heard of a woman. What are you talking about? There are no such thing as goddesses. There's no such thing as great mother, right? And it's just sort of this evolution over time to where now the Yahweh that we have is the pinnacle of hegemony.
I think that term there's a bigger point I want to make to that, because because it's more than just a political term that word is implying here. There's a lot more inertia and a lot of other concepts that orbit around that we use different language to describe. We're really talking the same thing, and I guess I get frustrated in that so many of these things has been twisted into an anti-male message. So it's all of this decoding and filtering I've got to do with these terms. But fundamentally, what they do is they undermine autonomy, which is the word I was going to use to really get
Mhm,
into the way people use freedom. There
mhm,
is a concerted effort to remove the autonomy of those who operate from a different modality. And I
mhm,
oftentimes talk about this concept of the aboriginal belt. And I draw a line from the two lines from the latitudinal line of Cancer and Capricorn. And you just make a band all the way around the planet. And everything between those lines seems to be where ground zero everything is, for from resources to the original origins of human beings in the most general sense of the understanding. And it seems
mhm,
like every time you hear about something jacked up happening to human beings, or places that fundamentally get imposed upon by these dynamics, it
mhm,
always seems to be these Abrahamic lines that come from outside of these regions imposing
mhm,
themselves inside these regions. And that's fundamentally the issue we see going on now, which leads us to, a lot of questions where, if you took a look at people who were outside of the Abrahamic lines, if they got into their original rhythms and orientations. In other words, getting out of these named deities and getting into concepts like the creator, and
mhm,
really getting into what was understood by the majority of human history.
mhm,
Do these systems maintain their credibility? And I think we're seeing what that plays out with the fourth industrial revolution, bringing places in the third world that didn't use these modalities, bringing them forward and seeing how they adopt to these concepts like materialism. You can almost see a sharp line between how this plays out. And I'll just use the continent as an example of places that maintain their original spiritual systems versus those places that readily adopted an Abrahamic modality. And you'll find that there were different ways that these things were expressed. The ones that maintained the original cultural seed and engaged in it got one set of outcomes, but then the others that imported different cultural values and then attempted to match the imported image. So the most textbook example of that is just the white Jesus idea. You start seeing these anaphylactic issues, these not autonomic, autoimmune issues in these cultures. It's almost self destructive, and it becomes anti internal culture. It goes out of its way to adopt something outside of the natural environment it's formed from, and they become perfect vessels for exploitation, almost exactly like a virus in the way it works. So I think there's ways you can go about doing that, but it ties us back into the fundamental disruption seems to have always been the structure of the family as it relates to the concept of community. And that has still maintained itself as the general building blocks for how people can disseminate and iterate power. The substitution, the disruption of the pattern went from having a connection to the land and the ancestors to some mythological entity that you owe because you exist now. You owe everything to that. And so you are functionally a slave to something that you can't see or feel or have the evidence towards, that inherently is everything and everywhere, but I'm not going to get into that convo. I think you see what I'm saying. It leads to a very paradoxical, limited understanding of something that has no limits. If you understand what I'm trying to say here.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I've said before that when children are born, their parents hand them the script. This is the script you read from. This is who you are. And you've got mom saying, I was in labor for 3 days. You owe me. And you've got, dad saying, well, who bought those clothes on your back? And then you go to school and they hand you a script and say, this is who you are. And then you go out into the world and you have somebody else handing you a script saying, this is who you are, usually the government, you are a worker and you pay taxes and you work 40 plus hours a week and you go to church. And we're handed these scripts, and it takes an awakening. Unfortunately, most of us have that awakening as adults to go, well, this is all dumb. I don't like any of this. This doesn't even feel humane. It doesn't feel like this is what humans were meant to do.
And we're back again to I'm gonna have the new age conversation eventually, because there's just too much them emerald tablets talk about that just makes entirely too much sense.
Mhm.
It fills in so many gaps. It explains things that are about to come out the bag anyway with the fourth industrial revolution. And it's why when I have this real deep dive into algorithmic power, why this idea of freedom, I think it would be good to begin progressing that concept of freedom into autonomy, because I
Mhm.
think the definition of freedom is about to radically change pretty soon with the
Yeah.
way the wave function of the human being and human beings in aggregate has and is being violated by these points that you're bringing up of already being given scripts to operate off of
Mhm.
outside of your level of awareness, let alone consent, to where you're
Right.
going on autopilot in a set of behaviors and beliefs that run contrary to your God given right as a being with consciousness
Mhm.
to be a community of this planet.
Well, and a lot of times that's what they call a red pill. I know that in a lot of spaces red pill means sort of something that has to do with, genders. But a red pill that awakens you to, "Oh, this system is messed up," can be anything. It can be realizing that the banking system is totally set up against you and that you are meant to be a lifetime of debt. Or it could be you in church one day going, "Wait a minute, none of this makes sense." It could be being in a relationship with somebody long term because that's who your parents liked and that's who you were supposed to be with and everything was good on paper, and then realizing you don't actually like them. There can be any amount of awakening, and that kind of that goes back to Maslow because he called those peak points, where you
Yep.
just sort of transcend out of your general state, and it gives you such a different perspective. It's so disorienting, but those can happen anywhere at any time. But we have to fight against all this indoctrination that we started getting from birth. Now, I tell people a lot, I'm open about it. My parents were hippies, like actual hippies. And so my upbringing was a little bit different. But even as, they are hippies during, the latter part of civil rights, movement going on and sit-ins and all these things. I heard about the man from when I was little bitty, but um there was still indoctrination that they were passing on unbeknownst to them because all of this stuff is so pervasive and so insidious that as soon as you think you've gotten to the root of all the indoctrination and the scripts and the nastiness, you will catch another layer. You will This onion is never ending. There is just layer after layer after layer.
Which is why it's been very beneficial to start getting into all of this research about the wave function of society and how that ties into algorithmic power, and understanding that that's the importance of consciousness. Consciousness gives you the capacity to recognize different parts of that layer that relate to the inner state of autonomy. Your
Mm,
capacity to, with agency, make an informed decision relative to your own personal objective and goal. And I
mhm.
think that there's been a way that that's been limited on purpose. And I'll say this for folks that are religious, so you don't mischaracterize the nature of us bringing up a examination of the way Christianity really has been abused. The Abrahamic faiths have been abused. It's not an assault on a belief or the faith. It's an understanding that people have taken the context of the way a lot of these stories and concepts and ideas and textures, texts and scriptures have been written, and animating them with a particular wavelength of thought that is inherently limiting. I'll use a popular example with the way that consistently plays out with a simple story like Daniel in the Lion's Den. Depending on the way you present it, it's a perfect tool so that you can liberate yourself, or it's a perfect tool for you to voluntarily enslave yourself. If you have an understanding of that story, being that Daniel is just sitting there waiting for God to take care of everything, like some kind of, weakling that doesn't have any ability to do something for themselves, that's one way you can interpret it. You can read it that way, and there's nothing stopping you from reading it that way. And you can say the exact same words that are in those scriptures. Or you can understand that same story with those same words to realize that irrespective of what he did, because he knew he was in the right, God was going to have his back no matter what he did. There is a completely different frequency those stories emit based on the level of consciousness you're at when you're understanding these things. The goal is to recognize that at times, these religious modalities are presented in a way to enforce certain parts of bandwidth of that message and either make moot, or not fully disclose the higher frequencies as it relates to those things. That's the real issue here.
I just did a show yesterday about Jesus. And that's what you're making me think of, because a lot of what Jesus preached was about life and living and autonomy. And you don't need the gatekeepers, you don't need the temple,
Yep.
you don't need the sacrifices, you don't need the
Yep.
priests, you can have a relationship with God the Father without all of this other mess.
Yep.
But then somehow the Romans who killed him and the Jews that he preached against were the two groups of people that became in charge of Jesus's message, to where Jesus then is presented as this very quiet, meek, submissive,
Turn the other cheek.
right,
That phrase.
reformed Jew or radical Jew, when that was never the message. He was turning over tables. He was calling people names. He told the Jews, your God is not the same as my God. Your father was a murderer from the beginning.
Yep.
We are not the same. We don't even worship the same God.
Nope.
And, you know, the message gets co-opted and changed. And so I've said numerous times, I'm never talking about the everyday Jewish person, the everyday Christian person, the everyday Muslim. I think the everyday person is just trying to do the best they can with what they have to work with. The systems, though, they're all about co-opting and control. That's all they've ever been about.
And that leads me to the whole conversation about the truth behind Babylon. I will
Yeah.
asterisk that because I want to have a whole, because that leads, I guess we talked a little bit about that last time we spoke. It's every indication I see from human beings across the planet has really caused me to really reconsider the narrative that surrounds that original location, all of
Mhm.
the astrological, all the archaeological evidence that's coming out about that time period and region, what we're learning about the Sahara Desert, what we're learning now about modern patterns, what we're learning now about Antarctica, what we've seen with various groups of people who have lived in both hemispheres along this aboriginal belt, how it's interesting that you seem to hear the same origin stories about human beings from people who are along this aboriginal belt, and the only people that got a different story about it are folks that are coming from this Abrahamic modality. I think there's an obvious pattern that's being spun. And with the cat being out the bag, now I think the rush is to flood so much information out there that you can hide the truth in plain sight, keep people distracted enough to where they're not paying attention to their own level of, and I'm going to really double down on this word, autonomy, so that they can act with full agency to decide what's best for them and to gain the full bandwidth of what this idea of spirituality and your relationship with God can be and would look like.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than this very specific bandwidth and spectrum that you need to stay within. And if you deviate anywhere towards that, it's the same as being some sort of evil villain that needs to be destroyed by the rest of the society.
Right.
I mean, it is infuriating sometimes when you get into some of the language you hear some people, and then when you learn the truth behind a lot of that. Because again, another disclosure: my father used to be a preacher, so I grew up with all of that, and he got frustrated for the same reasons I did. When he wanted to get into these stories and get into these messages using the same book, same verbiage, it's just certain things he wasn't allowed to talk about.
Right.
Certain things that people outside of people responsible for his credentials would interfere with him bringing up during services. And it just got so bad one day, he was just like, you know what, I'm good. Y'all got it. And it's a recurring theme.
Well, I think one thing is that a lot of people who go to seminary end up quitting seminary. Like that's one of the highest dropout rates because the more they learn, the more they realize, oh man, none of this is what I thought it was.
Yeah.
Now, I think a good example of what you keep talking about is the Dogon. Do you know?
Oh my goodness. I was going to talk about the whole story of Yurugu. I didn't want to digress into that, but I'll get into that later. I want to give Yurugu its own topic because it deserves that.
Okay.
I'm with you though. We're on the same page. We are definitely on the same page.
Great example of what you're talking about.
Oh my God. Shout out to Yurugu, man. He need to calm down. But I wanted to get into that when I start in the future having a conversation about hoodoo, because I'm absolutely going to have to visit that. We got to talk about hoodoo. I'm going to do that as a standalone because there's some points I want to get out there first and clarify, because there's a lot of misunderstanding surrounding that. And there's a lot that's been co-opted from it. There's a lot that's been misconstrued. And I think it is uniquely critical to understanding the African American experience in particular, because there is so much that's just autonomically baked into it that we do on a regular basis and don't even know. And our keys to getting a lens of coping with this goofiness going on in the greater sense, even within this Abrahamic modality, which really is a big reason as to why it happened in the first place. But yeah, I want to get into that level of conversation. I got to get back with Gyogami and really get into the Congo conversation, because there's a lot to that, and why the Abrahamic faiths took the direction that they did, and why here in this hemisphere we got the usual suspects pretty much being authorities in some of the concepts I just brought up, hoodoo in particular.
Right.
That's not a coincidence.
No, and that, I mean, that's honestly why I brought up the Dogon, because you know, you had the usual suspects saying, well, they must have only known what they know because they must have run into one of us.
That nonsense.
Right. And they're like, well, who'd they run into? I don't know. I'm just saying the only way that they could know this stuff is if one of us came and taught them. They couldn't have figured all this out on their own. Come on now.
And then they come to find out you got Sangoma down in South Africa corroborating the exact same thing.
Right.
Anyway, y'all. Anyway, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
I'm gonna get on that topic, and I think that'll be really worth getting into because there's a lot of content that's been coming out in the media in alignment with that, because I think it's important to understand that that particular frequency has been blocked and distorted for a reason. I'm gonna
Mm-hmm.
put a spotlight on Ryan Coogler because, and this is that'll be my little segue. I think that with that movie Sinners, people got to dip their toe into the concept a bit more from a different angle, and they got
Mm-hmm.
to see it without the usual line of interference, without the goofy spookism, without the theatric extra nonsense. It was just it at its core on a base level. And it's interesting timing because we've got a potential Blade coming out again with uh Wesley Snipes potentially starring that. And then we've got a continuation of the Doctor Strange series, which already is being set up for the introduction of Brother Voodoo. And we already know that the last movie for Black Panther had the new Black Panther, the one that escaped the destruction of Wakanda. He's in Haiti right now. And they named him Tucson. So we're going to have there's going to be a line of media that'll be brought to the mainstream consciousness again related to these topics that I think is going to be very important to examine, because this is going to offer the unadulterated understanding of these things, which is just cultural lenses of what we've been doing all the way back on the continent. When these concepts first got presented, this is old news. But we haven't seen that brought to a silver screen the way we've done it, because the gatekeepers to it has always been the usual suspects. So there's certain parts of that frequency that have always been tapped down into doctrine and are only allowed from a particular point of view, or it's always somebody that's being brought in to give access to that on some gatekeeper type of energy.
You know what that's making me think of is like Pirates of the Caribbean. Was it Calypso? That
Yeah.
Yeah, and the way that she's portrayed. And so
Yep.
when things like that are on the silver screen, it's very demonic.
Yep.
It's bad magic. It's be careful what you wish for,
Yep.
because you're gonna have to pay for it later. Even that Princess and the Frog.
I was just about to go to that. And when you do see it, oftentimes men that are affiliated with that tradition are intentionally demonized on a particular type of way.
Yeah.
And these patterns aren't accidental. I'm going to get into that when I get into the deeper aspects of hoodoo. And unironically, this specific time period from 1830 really into the 1930s, where we see
Mhm.
the transition of it being on one frequency and very baseline into it turning into this commercialized goofery we see in some instances, in most instances, where the people who are most highly involved with it go back to the usual suspects. Like there
Right.
was a process involved with that. It's controlled introduction into media and its influence as far as its dissonant connections to things like obia and actual voodoo. Like this all played Hollywood was a major component into propagating and capitalizing on a lot of the energy that's presented there. So yeah, to that very point you were bringing up, and to really ground more of these things, to see them from our internal perspective. There's so many things folks do they don't even think about it. Right now, some people that are listening to me got the Book of Psalms sitting on their dresser somewhere. When they're walking outside, they don't step on cracks for a reason. There's certain things you do with candles and desks and tables that you have pictures of loved ones on, certain things you arrange certain ways. Those things, we'll just say there's a lot of autonomic behavior going on with that than you may realize. And I'll get into all of that later, but it's not this giant spookism that most people have turned it into and have made it be. There's a lot of grounding aspects that are not only very human, they play many different roles of healthy acclimation to life in general, to yourself, to other people, and those that are responsible for you even being here right now living. I think these are important things that for the majority of our history on this planet, we've had unmitigated access to. That thanks to a lot of these artificial doctoring of the bandwidth, this isolation to a very low frequency level of being, we've only engaged just a fraction of the spectrum. There's so much more that's in alignment that isn't going to violate that law, that is not only good for you, it will allow for you to gain a different perspective so you can make use of these higher ideas and functions.
Well, I think to kind of drive home when you talk about, the lower bandwidth and those kind of things, even if you apply it to Maslow's, if you look at Western culture, the focus is always
The
sex,
bottom two
food.
floors.
Well, it's sex, food, and shelter,
The bottom two
right?
floors. Yep.
Yeah. So, even if it's, I want a bigger house, I want more money. So, and money becomes the representative of food, sex, and shelter, right? So even, I want a better car. Why? So, now some people just love cars, right? But that's what we think about on a daily basis. And, money becomes our mammon, it becomes what we worship, and then we revere the hustle, right? So the bankers are our new priests. And sorry if you can hear my dog chewing on a squeak toy, I'm not going to stop her, because she's entertained. But that's that whole operating on that lower bandwidth of all we're ever really thinking about is food, sex, and shelter. What kind of house do I have? Who's on my arm? And what am I eating for dinner? We don't ever think about really, or put a lot of thought into things beyond that.
Well, that's what the wave function, the societal wave function, has been geared towards overwhelmingly since we've got into this commoditization. Like, that's the whole idea behind it all. You can even see some of this happening on the continent when you get into people, I'm going to say, during the colonization period on the continent. The idea of trinketry. That's pretty much what sold it. Lack of communication and trinketry. It exploited a natural human vulnerability to these things because you're in an environment where all of those things are already provided for you. You're on the continent. So if you can create a sense of artificial scarcity of something, you can focus that, you can reprogram the idea of what those first floors mean, like their definition, their settings. That's what I was talking about with regard to this understanding of how you can be engaged at a particular level with those bottom floors. And I like equating this to the chakra system because fundamentally what you were describing is root chakra stuff.
Right.
If you understand that that is the primordial beginning, the inertia that's needed to drive up along the system, you also come to understand that when you have an understanding beyond the heart gate, you don't need as much of those things on the lower realm to maintain yourself at the higher. So even though those things become needed, they're mandatory to get to a certain point. Once you get past a certain point, you have an understanding of them. Your sense of value, your need, your efficacy to maintain that higher state of perspective doesn't require those things on the bottom to the same degree. And so your definitions of what it means to go without that begins to shift radically. And you notice that there's a tapering off of a need of those lower frequency things over time, to the point where when you get into certain aspects of transcendence in a more visceral sense, there's a complete de-emphasis of these things. But if you do that without going through the preparatory stages, in particular, going through that difficult work of breaking through mastery of those things so that you can paradoxically learn to let go of what you've mastered and have that solid foundation built on the self-generation of these things and the capacity to offer that in a substantive sense to other people voluntarily. then it's easy for people to use the promise of transcendence to control people as well, which is what we see on the flip side of that.
Mhm.
That was the other side of the mechanism of control, offering this flowery transcendence promise without giving the tools to actually build to get there and sustain it. And that's the whole pie in the skyism that you run into with regard to that.
Well, I hate to bash on the Abrahamic religions again, but it's that same, you'll get your reward after death, right? If you
Pie in
just
the
follow
sky.
the rules, you transcend, right? You are saved because somebody died 2000 years ago who never said they were dying for you, but somebody else 100 years later said they did. So, you can suffer all you want and you'll transcend, at the very end. And then you look around and go, well, how come you're blessed by God? You say you're blessed by God and you're a bajillionaire, but I'm broke and you're saying I'm the blessed one and I'll get my reward after death. I mean, that sounds like a grift to me.
And there we go with the entire pattern that gets promised through governmental modalities in this commoditization pattern we see in all these other systems. I was linking all of that back to the pattern of the Abrahamic modalities being abused because I've
Yeah.
never seen other modalities exploit people that way. Now, maybe there can be an argument made for certain governments that came out of certain parts of Asia, but
I think
I'm gonna
capitalism
spend some time
exploits
on that.
people in that way, but I think capitalism and the Abrahamic religions work hand in hand.
That's the point I'm making with regard to that. That particular aspect of capitalism that renders itself to being exploited that way does
Mm.
that. So like the system's fine. The problem is when you put that cultural template to it and then you run that system, you start running into problems. Especially when you adopt it to groups of people who don't come from an environment of chronic scarcity, or even to the earlier point you were making about the, I'm going to say, noted Neanderthal difference. Because, shout out to the Neanderthal Genome Project in 2011 when Neanderthals went from these slow, brain dead ooga boogas that aren't intelligent to being hyper geniuses. And so, it was just convenient that they found out everybody outside the continent of Africa had a percentage minimum of 4% or greater,
Hmm.
of that Neanderthal genome, that suddenly Neanderthals overnight became super geniuses. But, you know, you get into some of the studies that you were highlighting, and you start noticing that with them in particular, there were problems between the men and women. You didn't have the females living comfortably around the males. The males were hyper aggressive in a lot of instances. And you start seeing these patterns of, you've heard the story of the caveman knocking the chick over the head and dragging her into the cave. And, all of a sudden she comes back to the tribe and she's pregnant. Don't nobody know who the dad is, but the kid's a little strange. You start seeing that pattern show up with regard to that. And it's just interesting watching these things play out down the line. So when you've got these systems that validate these matters, these patterns of behavior, like, they'll cite Neanderthals hunting woolly mammoth. And to get one, they'll run a whole herd of mammoths off a cliff. That type of logic, is kind of like what you're dealing with regard to that. And I don't want to get into too much of a Michael Bradley convo if you read the Iceman Inheritance, but you can see that kind of pattern of exploitation being given pathways of logic and justification. And it's baked into the way you see a lot of people validate their value system. And these things are just one of many different configurations. It's not the only one. It's just that if you're not aware of these patterns and you find yourself in the modern era, and you've got all of these scripts running in the background, and you've got all of these logistical justifications that prompt you to want to behave that way, if you're not aware of their origins, here you are having to download all these extra bits of information so that you can just cope, so that you can just reach to that ground zero. And at that point, what energy do you have to operate and work on getting this transcendent point? I don't think you've got anything left. And I think that fundamentally represents the problem that ultimately gets presented by this as to why, number one, it gets exploited, and number two, why many people don't find themselves in a position to try to aim for these things. Because I think the way human beings had life figured out in the past, there was time to really pursue these things now. But paradoxically, as we enter into the fourth industrial revolution, and the definition of work and labor is beginning to change now, people are having more time to think about these things. I think COVID was an excellent illustration of that point. With this time to consider, these are things you want to begin to look at. What is your why? What matters to you and how? What is there of value to you beyond having these material things? Do you really want to participate in a system and culture that's inherently designed to artificially place limitations on the limitless? And is that serving you ultimately for what it is you want for yourself and those that you care about in your immediate vicinity? And is that a world you want to send anybody else into in the future? Basic questions.
And on that, I think, one of the things that happened during COVID, and it's gained even more momentum, is that the kinds of things that people were researching was like gardening or crocheting or sewing or cooking, and and looking at things more simply. One of the things that I talk about a lot is that part of the indoctrination that we're given, beyond just that each of us are dirty, terrible sinner, people who are full of disease. We're all taught that, but we're all taught to be scared of outside. We're told outside is dangerous. Don't eat plants from outside, and don't go around in the woods, and don't be where animals are, and don't touch this and don't do that. And if you're ever outside, you're going to starve to death and you're going to die from gangrene. And they tell us all these things. And it's like, well, humans lived outside for hundreds of thousands of years. There wasn't much of an inside, right? Inside was shelter for sleeping. Outside was where everything happened. And and the earth literally is where humans spawned. So it literally wants to give life. It literally grows food for humans. It gives shelter, it gives shade, it gives sunlight, it gives rest, it gives food. It gives us everything we need. But living in a capitalist society, everything that we need, from water to air in some circumstances, is commodified. That it I tell the story about, when they wanted to plant trees in the city, and they only planted male trees because they didn't want people to have free food. They didn't want people to have fruit. And this is why we have such bad allergies nowadays, is because all of these male trees put all this pollen in the air, and there's nowhere for the pollen to go. So now we have this epidemic of allergies, because simply because if they planted fruit trees, it would affect the grocer's bottom line.
And we see that being a big deal starting in the 1920s. And again, we're
Right.
back to the same time period where these things start really becoming an issue 20 years later after that, out of fear of there being gross shortages of food. You get the altered wheat crops that show up. You get the bread that's being tampered with, and the introduction of folic acid to it, and how folic acid don't even get absorbed. And so there's all these secondary issues that are happening, like the demonification, yeah, that's what I want. It's the demonification of nature, or nature being postured as some sort of evil entity that has to be overcome and fought. Like,
Mhm.
it just wants to kill you.
Right.
That's I mean, sure, maybe under certain circumstances and contexts, but I mean, our ancestors made peace with it for the overwhelming majority of our history. And it's only all of a sudden, because this documentary is saying that, nature's a problem.
Right.
When, I can go look at the Hadza tribe right now, who I share a direct line of effect with genetically speaking. And I can see these people reaching their arm into a damn tree and pulling out honeycomb and munching on it, getting stung on. I, and
Well,
they're
I
and they're
think
perfectly fine.
well, I think the thing that happens is that outside, nature is, demonized, and then it's not forefront in our psyche. And so we lose our ability to intrinsically just co cohabitate with nature, to understand what it is. Not only are we not being taught, because we're all inside now in air conditioning, shout out to air conditioning, but um, we're not taught, but it's also not in our psyche to watch things, to know. Um, one of the interesting things is I can look at trees and tell you when it's going to rain. And it
Right.
sounds a little woo woo, right?
No,
But
you can see the leaves fold up. There's a
the
scent
leaves
that
turn
comes
up,
from the back.
right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. You
Right.
can tell. Yeah.
But you can tell when it's gonna lightning because there's a smell, right?
Yep.
And you can tell when it's gonna rain because the leaves are turned up. But, you think about people who are in urban settings and you look at a tree and you're like, "Oh, it's gonna rain." And they're like, "Which?"
Yeah,
Right?
they've completely lost. Yeah.
Because we're not taught these things. We're not taught, and it's out of our psyche, and out of sight, out of mind. And so we forget how to cohabitate with nature. So when you say, in some ways nature might be set out to kill you, nature's never set out to kill you, because all nature wants to do is flourish. If you look at nature, that's all it ever wants to do, is to flourish. And human beings are a part of nature. We always have been. We've removed ourselves from nature, so we don't know how to interact with it anymore.
And that was the whole point I was bringing up before, last month when I was talking about this understanding of empathy and the potential atrophying of these things if it becomes part of the way function to operate that way. I still think that there's a desire to not do that. I think that once people got an opportunity to slow down and really question their surroundings, they
Mhm.
realized they had a distaste for a lot of this, which is why I'm
Yeah.
not nihilistic about it. It's just a matter of when the technology gets here to make that happen, I think we're going to see a bit of a hybridization take place where I
Yeah.
think that the technology and nature can finally have a proper synthesis with one another and operate synergistically rather than antagonistic
Mhm.
the way it has been. And I think a lot of, I'll say this last point, you got it. I think a lot of the origin of this antagonism with regard to technology and nature comes from things that would have made that synergy possible tend to also be less profitable and
Mhm.
exploitable by a small amount of people, which was getting to some of the points we were bringing up earlier.
Right. Right, because, like, community gardening is illegal in some places, and the male trees, and,
Right.
because if they can't make a buck on it, then they make it illegal.
Yep.
So, one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking was, that's why I brought up COVID and what people were looking up, gardening and crocheting and sewing and these simple things that are self-sustaining, right?
Yep.
That people learned how to work on their own car. I think you're right in that people will use technology. Some people will use technology to create a more simple life. They may be using ChatGPT to figure out a planting schedule for a garden in their backyard,
Yep.
and to, like, figure out what kind of soil they have to be able to grow things, and that's that synergy, because we don't have the people here in the West readily available to teach us these things. So we'll use AI or the internet just in general to figure out how to live simply. And I think as, I don't know if we're in a recession right now or what, but eggs cost $100. I'm being hyperbolic, but you know what I'm saying? Like, you you have to. We have to. The renting and housing market is out of control. Everything costs so much money. We're gonna have to figure out how to live simply and live poor. And unfortunate for some people, being able to live poor, which another way to say that is to live resourcefully, is a skill, and a lot of people don't have it, and they're going to be in trouble the worse things get in our economy because they don't have the skill set to live poor or to live resourcefully, and they're going to have to figure it out or they're going to be in trouble.
I'm vegan and I eat once a day and I'm a minimalist. And I've been on that for going on 12 years now.
So you don't care how much eggs cost. Fine. They must be rubbing it in. The rest of us have to buy eggs.
But I'm saying that because I'm reminded of what it was like at COVID and being here in Dallas. Most people here, it's all about meat. So I would go to the store and people would be almost in abject panic trying to get all the different meats that they would need to get, all the different dairy products.
Mm-hmm.
And they would be leaving behind very baseline things like quinoa, barley would be untouched. You'd have teff grain that was untouched. People don't even know what teff is. You'd have all the white rice is gone, but they got the multigrain rice still there. They don't even think to go into the international section. You'd have things like pumpernickel bread untouched. You know what I'm saying? Like all these basics, but toilet paper and rice, you just couldn't find nowhere. And it's
Right.
like, it really, you know what I'm saying? Like and I'm saying that to your point when you spoke about people adjusting, that lack of having a connection and understanding and even an inherent fear of anything outside of what's in the sad diet. It really reveals itself.
Mm-hmm.
I saw there was a myriad of herbal beneficiaries that were there that people could have taken access to, still was left on the shelf pretty much untouched.
Right.
All I had to do was any store I wanted to go to. Every shelf would almost be completely empty except the international shelf, which would be stocked, packed full. It just blew my mind. And it would have everything people are looking for right there, or could use and get by.
Well, I think could use and get by is the thing, because we're taught in Western society that every meal is steak and potatoes, some variation of steak and potatoes for every single meal. And if you want some variety, throw some pasta in, right? Like
Yep.
we're not taught the importance of vegetables. And then, the food pyramid, which ends up being debunked, and, they prove that it's a scam, but people are still following it. I need 5 servings of oatmeal every day. I need all of this pasta and all of these carbs. And we're not even taught about vegetables and how important vegetables and fruits are. And people think corn and potatoes are vegetables. So like, I got my vegetables because I had corn and potatoes.
There's a disconnect. There's a disconnect from the nutritional part and the food part. There's just this assumption that, I got a piece of meat. The meat has everything I need. And I got whatever I can eat on the side and I'm good. And
Right.
a lot of the understanding is coming from people from, silent generation and a little bit before then, getting by on that, but they're not understanding that at that time period, this is before the heavy industrialization of the food industry.
Oh, for sure.
So the quality of those ingredients that they were consuming is much higher back than what it is now. These are all things that
great granny could eat biscuits every morning with gravy made with lard and smoke a Pall Mall and live to be 90.
Because those were all good whole ingredients that
They
they
were
were using.
whole ingredients.
Like now, the soil is so depleted of those trace nutrients and trace minerals. You've got these super vegetables that are massive, but they're grown to get big. They don't have any of the trace minerals that we were eating the vegetables for in the first place for that were in the soil.
Right.
So You know,
They're all
these are things,
genetically modified and they've lost a lot of their value.
well, even before you get that, the whole reason we're eating the plants is because we need the mineral that's in the soil. So the only people that understand that aspect are people who grow stuff. They're the ones that understand that you've got to rotate crops to preserve the soil and then do certain things that put certain minerals back into the soil, not just so that the plant will grow, but so that it will maintain its nutritional value. Because you're not eating the plant just because like the leaf substance has everything. It's the substance in the leaf and the plant itself is absorbing the minerals in a biological form that's accessible to our digestive system in plant form. That's the magic of the plant. It's
Right.
taking what's in the ground and putting it in a form we can digest. And
Right.
like
You stop
not
having
even
to take vitamins and minerals every day that you buy in pill form if you can just eat them.
but you've got to be able to break them down and digest them. And that only happens when you get those whole ingredients that are grown in an
Yep.
environment it was designed for. So that's how people can be overfed but undernourished. That's the way I articulate that point, which is
Mhm.
just one of those other byproducts, you know? And I think that ties into, you know, reason number 9,999 as to why people don't ever have the time and the energy to focus on those higher points on the pyramid. They're just stuck with this constantly getting by, being bombarded with medical issues, non communicatable issues. And I'm digressing slightly, but just recently, I think it was, I don't know if it happened in Texas. I got to look it up again. Another state came on to signing the understanding, state law, that food is medicine. So now there's a movement, I think it's 20 states have it now, that doctors can assign for people suffering from non-communicatable diseases and chronic issues. They can now prescribe foods as medicine to address that, which would then allow for it to be covered by insurance.
I love that.
Yeah, that's a really positive movement I'm seeing in certain states now. So definitely something to take a look at.
Well, Nameless, we're getting close to that 2-hour mark, and like Cinderella, I expire.
Yep. Yep. So if you guys have any questions real quick, if you're down to take a few,
Sure, sure,
we can
sure.
go over that and do a quick review. I think we can kind of continue because this transcendence piece has a lot of different vectors. I
Oh
think
yeah.
what we can do next time is kind of review individual transcendence and then have its relationship to the people around you or the aggregate, you know, the societal
Hmm.
understanding. Because I think there's a point to be made about the kind of environment that's created based off the culture that understands that idea of
Hmm.
transcendence and how it can contrast greatly from the individual. But there's definitely lines of effect to that. And I'll give the illustration of a lower level of civilization tends to have, and I'm going to put lower level civilization specifically as it relates to technology, tends to have a higher occurrence from that culture of emphasis and understanding of transcendence. You know, that
Hmm.
idea of transcendental experience and having that greater societal integration of these concepts. I think there's definitely something there that's worth examining because I think paradoxically, as the technology gets more sophisticated, we may see an expansion in both directions to that, where I think you're going to get both extremes represented more so now, where there's going to be a lot of people able to have the time to invest now into this idea of transcendence and really pursue it. And then others that are going to be greater, have a greater distance away from that because they may be more engrossed into the technology itself, seeing it as a means of an end rather than a tool to assist in that.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's see. Yeah, the idea of yeah. I mean, we're seeing that being adopted with the third world that's taken on a lot of fourth industrial technology as we speak, and as people get a bit more knowledgeable on how these things can play out in the long run, we're seeing some of these technologies being brought on board with that as being a sub goal, and the intentional integration of techno transient modalities. I think that was really isolated in a lot of sci-fi at first, but I think you're going to hear a lot more about that in the very near future if you aren't already. But I don't see too many questions here, so we'll go ahead and start the wrap up process. Maggie, I appreciate you coming back up again.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Let's see, we do got one quick one from it says, Maggie, you said you used to be a feminist. What got you going on this journey? How does the maligning of the goddess principle fit into global hegemony?
Whew. Okay. Well, those are two big questions. Um, I I used to label myself as a feminist because of how feminism was sold to me, um, which was about equality, right? The more I learned about the feminist movement, where it came from, going even all the way back to the suffragettes, and learning about the movement and what the fallout was from the movement, and especially how neo-feminism is just women becoming men and making displaying men as lesser. They just wanted to flip the script instead of equality. Like, this idea of equality, for some reason, feminism made it to where if a woman wants to be a man, and I'm not talking about transgender, I'm talking about operating as a man, she has every right to do so and can do so. But then it sort of morphed into this: if a woman wanted to do traditional womanly things, then she was anti-woman. But I thought the whole thing was about choice, right? Like, it was choice. Like, I wanted to stay home and raise kids. Like, that's what I wanted to do. But I was seen as anti-feminist just simply for that. And so I think just learning about it really opened my eyes. So, you know, um, nowadays I refer to myself as a transcendentalist, spiritually, politically, as far as civil rights are concerned, because I believe in that same basic tenet. So, for those of you that follow my channel, you'll know I also have a website on modern transcendentalism, and it's for that simple fact. So that's what sort of moved me away from that, because we lost we lost what it means to be a woman in women trying to be men. So that's the answer to that one. What was the second part of that question? It was something about, oh, there it is. How
Yeah.
does the maligning of the goddess principle fit into global hegemony? Well, I think what happens is the goddess principle. I'm gonna say what the fallout is now, and then kind of go backwards. What we have now is we will have a bunch of women saying, "We lost the goddess. I'm a goddess. Revere me." you know, um, call me goddess, worship me like a goddess. But nobody, it's sort of like what I talked about before about nature. It's out of sight, out of mind. It's out of our psyche. We've totally lost what it means to embrace the goddess. So, for instance, in the Colburn Bible, and I bring this up sometimes, the advent of woman was not to be a personal secretary to man, even though that's what's taught in Abrahamic. She was his tether to the divine. And when we look, historically, that again, like I said before, your spiritual inheritance came from your mother. That fits, right? But even when you look in the Bible and you look at the original Greek, when it says help or helpmate, That's how it was translated. The word that's actually used is a word that means help from God. So it's God saying, anytime you need help, look to this woman. She will help you because she is to embody help from God. And so when we look at the goddesses, we look at, Astarte, Inanna, Hathor, we look at all of these amazing goddesses. Um, we don't, we forgot how to embody that in this sort of patriarchal type of religion, right? Where the great mother gets replaced with the Holy Spirit, right? Where God is the father and the mother and the son, and he's everybody. And the father can't teach how to be a divine feminine. The Just like the mother can't teach how to be a divine masculine. And so in hiding that, it usurps the man, because as women, we in modern times we've been trying so hard to be men after we lost the ability to embrace and embody the divine goddess. We don't know how to woman anymore. And so the man does not have his tether to the spiritual world. The children don't get their spiritual inheritance because we lost it.
Yeah, I'm really reminded of a stream I wanted to do about Isis and her quest, and how fundamentally the problem now is we're in a situation where Isis needs to produce a Horus, and you're not getting that until Isis goes on her quest. And
Right.
there's a lot of elements that are preventing that quest from taking place right now. And it's paradoxically a shadow expression of the very point you articulated. Because what
Right.
I observe happening is that we saw the crazy example. Two things happen. Number one, you got the segment principle happen, and nobody told her to chill out.
Yeah.
That's problem number one. Problem number two, they demonized Bastet. So that whole
Mhm.
concept of Bastet, that's your whole story right now. You are on that type of energy, and they've demonized it, saying that that's a symbol of weakness, not
Right.
understanding that that was a lesson learned from mistakes Sekhmet made,
Mhm.
totally over people's heads, followed by the fact that there's some people who sided with Set
Mhm.
as Isis in her position, sided with Set and said, I want to be like him, rather than understanding that there was a whole separate process that was supposed to occur. And you were supposed to be a facilitator for Heru to step in and do what they needed to do. So there's a demand for Heru to show up, but they're a whole sidekick to Set now and expecting a
Right.
different outcome. You can't. It's almost schizophrenic in nature, the demands that are being made across the board. And the end result is this hostile environment we see towards everything.
Right. Right. So you have everybody mad at each other. So Rael said, so would you say the concept of the muse is a broken fragment of the goddess principle, almost where she is inspirational to man but unattainable to man? I think I don't think it's necessarily a broken fragment. I think woman is supposed to be a muse to her man. She's supposed to inspire. She's supposed to guide. When I talk about the relationship between men and women, the man is the leader and the woman is the guide. You're going to get to where you're going a lot faster and a lot happier if you have a leader and a guide. He's driving the car, she's holding the map, right? And so she's supposed to be a muse, and at the same time she's supposed to be unattainable to other men, right? And so other men could view her as a muse, right? Because maybe they are inspired by her. simply because if you're embracing divine femininity, you're going to be a muse for more than just your man. Hopefully that makes sense.
And there's also a principle that I want to remind you of, Rael, that has been profoundly exploitative in the way that fear is invoked in women to promote consumerism. In men, the image of women is corralled to be a source of exploitation to hyper
Mhm.
focus and channel masculine energy. In other words, the promise of attaining is an exploitation of the contract. There is a bait provided for in the access, the potential access to women. But then it's kept just out of reach through commercial means. That we see a lot of this play out.
Mhm.
So the dream of getting access to that is kept alive by hyper projecting it over and over and over and over and over again, using it as a source of motivation. But the end
Well, and
result is
remember, we're all told to focus on food, shelter, and sex.
correct. And this is just one way it expresses itself. So it's
Right.
keeping us tied. That's why I said it was a root chakra energy. It's just for men and women, it expresses through different vectors at times.
Mhm.
So there's the
Mhm.
material fear of material acquisition, which the government is acting as a surrogate to. And then there's the attention and proxy focus and stimulation of the drive to pursue women without actually giving you the tool to produce family, which is supposed to be the end result of that drive. These
Mhm.
rules are constantly being exploited and violated by the same channels that are seeking to create commoditization of the society. It's what happens to bulls and studs on plantations and farms. It's no different. But that may be a separate conversation. You know, the commoditization of the root chakra and how that plays out in the complete mismatching of men and women and what's supposed to be attainable for either or, because the end results, people who are well matched aren't matching, and the line of
Right.
expectation is completely distorted.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But I don't want to keep you too long. We've passed the 2 hour mark. I think we got some good points to build on for next week. So we'll make a pause for here, and you can let me know, like usual, what time you're available, and we'll continue with part 5 then. So we'll go
Okay.
ahead and close out. It's been a pleasure having you up. Appreciate you, Maggie.
Thank you so much.
All right. So we'll go ahead and close out. I appreciate you. To the founders of the space. Us. To the members that are listening in the future to the playback. Us. This has been the Nameless Protagonist. Have a good rest of your day. And remember, wari wari no michi. This is the way.